Hello everyone, today we talk about 13th century Western European infantrymen. This is a historical units type video and we will take in consideration different aspects of, in fact, this troops' armament, equipment, training, whatever. I have covered extensively at this point, also because I de facto specialize a bit in the same, mostly in early 14th century Western European, not just infantry, but at least I research a lot about that specifically. And as you know, if you have already followed my content, in fact, there is a playlist on infantry warfare, specifically if you're particularly curious, you haven't found out already. That deals a lot with the way we have popularized what infantry worked like in relation with cavalry, unavoidably throughout essentially the late Middle Ages. I will not digress on the usual story. People think again that infantry had a gradual, positive, and interrupted rise, and or just specifically in the 14th and 15th century was just a linear growth. In that sense, no, right? That's a part of the so-called military revolution, or just a positivistic, progressistic myth that we have debunked, because, again, mid-15th century Pikes squares have hardly anything to do with early 14th century bourgeois or peasant infantry victories in some parts of Europe. They're very interesting topics, and getting them right, I think, means to, just by the Clausewitzian Trinity, like understanding properly medieval politics and society well, right? You can't say the same for all three of these elements, but we have sort of been convinced that we study warfare just in function of society and politics, as if, you could study politics or society just for the sake of themselves instead, right? As if warfare was just, just a bad thing that you shouldn't focus too much because you're sort of a militaristic, evil imperialist or whatever, all this kind of nonsense, of course. Also because actually there is nothing wrong in a genuine military historical interest, as much as in actually wanting the expansion of a morally superior power, for that matter. That's in fact beyond our scope today. It's important to introduce, before passing to arms and armor, as such, in fact, the essentials of 13th century warfare a bit. You already know them if you have been following me from a while. Essentially, this century is the peak of feudal warfare, broadly meant, meaning that, as we'll see now, there wasn't just the feudal system in Europe at this point, nor what actually was beyond that has anything to do with other systems outside of the feudal system. We're talking, in a geographical sense, feudal Europe, Western Europe, was shockingly advanced, also and especially because the feudal system had fostered, for example, communal civilization, and this existed in parallel and in syntony to some important extent as well, when you look at arms integrations on the battlefield in, say, apparently non-feudal realities. Well, they were fighting exactly like in feudal realities when you look at the field, and actually, or sometimes even in more advanced way, right? Some of the most updated feudal monarchies out there. However, and this is the point, in fact, of it all, while 13th century witnesses the peak of heavy cavalry and its greatest level of degree of dominance in the sedentary world, like in medieval art of war, you realize that also infantry actually was at its peak, right, in the same moment. This is incredibly important to realize, because there is this misconception of thinking that cavalry and infantry force had just a sort of sinusoidal relation within one another, meaning that when cavalry was strong, infantry was weak, also in absolute terms. This is absolutely wrong, right? Cavalry was superior. In this century, there was factually nobody who managed to defeat heavy cavalry in open field in a conventional clash. And this is something that was going on since essentially the third quarter of the 12th century. In fact, cavalry absolute dominance wouldn't last but until the early 14th century. Then it actually regains an important capacity in the later 14th century. Then in the 15th century, we've seen things change, but up to that point, still during the ancien regime, in the post 14th century crisis, actually cavalry was dominant. It actually crushed the same armies, infantry armies that had scored victories over cavalry at the beginning of the 14th century, because of the demographic, the economical collapse of the estates that had expressed those infantries that were still, however, some sort of exception, right? And this is also very important. Not just in the 13th century, infantry was very highly developed, even when it was subordinated to heavy cavalry on the battlefield, but it was normal, prevalent, and especially convenient to subordinate your very strong infantry to cavalry, right? Since there is being, of course, an enormous sort of classistic, structuralistic influence, unfortunately, even in the way of telling military history. Say the culturalism of the new military history is one of the greatest intellectual abortions in the history of mankind, simply because these people have never opened, not just at von Kriege, but they haven't, in fact, ever studied the art of war in a diachronic and comparative way. Even though they're trying to sell you the myth that they actually have. No, right? From the 70s, nobody has done that. So it's useless to flatter yourself with that, and especially in a certain part of the West. Then in this other one, we admittedly didn't even study military history, but we were not particularly biased when it came to the methods and that had been previously used in the times of evidential history, that actually the same structuralists never addressed as something that inexplicably people think that these would have allegedly been saying at the time. That is, you just must study the socio-economical side of the story and eliminating the evidential side, the political or military history. That's what lesser people do, right? And that's why the world is also in this current amoral and acultural situation. But aside from this, this is the factual point that having a military system in which you are able to integrate cavalry and infantry means to be a superior civilization of a system that instead has only banally just infantry, just because they are basically, in fact, even an estate in revolt in some decentralized areas that maybe in some cases were rich, but most of the times were actually depressed, and that part of the reason why they didn't have much cavalry themselves, and that anyhow did not start, in fact, in the early 14th century, any meaningful military tradition that wasn't eventually unhinged, in fact, later by the very heavy cavalry that at some point they did manage to defeat, right? So they try to make you pass in that sort of, infantry rose because it was the future story, the superiority of certain infantries in that context that actually were not absolutely and objectively superior to others operating in a system subordinated to heavy cavalry, right? And we will see this better in other videos. Today's video is generic regarding, again, Western Europe as a whole, that, as you know, was becoming ever more homogeneous, and just it had the same fundamentals, especially after the expansion of the Frankish system, if you want to call it like this, and still, of course, in a sanitary reality. We're talking here primarily heavy infantry. There is some picture inserted, of course, about missile troops also in the thumbnail, and that's okay, because, of course, here we're talking infantry in general, but, of course, when it comes to arms and armor, prevalently we will be talking in some other single videos about, say, an archer's crossbow, and as we already done that, slingers even recently. But we're going to focus on the heavier equipment, and so what this infantry was about. And of course, there were instances in which on the battlefield, even a system integrating cavalry and infantry could produce a situation in which infantry was, for example, left alone. This was actually normal if you think about it, because cavalry, once broken and having, being the decisive arm, it would left the field, first of all, more speedily, but would leave at that point no chance to infantry to actually survive against cavalry, except some circumstances in which you see an atrocious infantry resistance. I think about the battles of Bouvines with the Flemish pikemen that get themselves slaughtered till the last man, even when they were surrounded by the French army. We're talking about the Lombard infantry at Cortenuova that held out until sunset against the charges of heavy imperial cavalry that I would like to stress here, talking the French, talking the German, talking about the highest, like the peak, not just of moral, but also technical superiority of feudal cavalry at this point. So also in this context, we will be talking about infantrymen in a context which also cavalry is homogeneous, right, as much as they are fundamentally. So you can't pick any country in Western Europe and looking at it and say, I don't know, England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, they have basically the same type of troops, all right? There can be local variations, whatever, but it's in the fundamentals, it's the same thing. And as such, in fact, we should think more medieval warfare, not much a matter of particularism, that definitely in its existence can tell us a lot about like certain, again, military, political, and social indicators and differences, and it's easier really because these countries were all that similar, right? But in fact, you must never forget the actual iceberg as a whole, not just the tip, right? This is something, in fact, done very much with technologism, modernism regarding these differences, whereas the most important thing is how much the system had in common and how much, in fact, these armies were also very much integrated internationally with one another, right? 13th century is the peak of European blend, even in terms of national contingents in the greatest battles of this era. We're talking, if you look at Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, the greatest cavalry, feudal cavalry battles ever fought, right, historically speaking. So, and where infantry did have an importance, even though, especially in the more feudal contexts properly meant, their relevance was sort of downsized because of the traditional senses of, say, castes hierarchy, for which, of course, what truly mattered, what was kings and noblemen did, and the commoners were just, again, the lesser element. That, however, we know being there, having substantial capacities, and being actually necessary in order for, in this, as we've seen, essentially symmetrical context, cavalry to win. Right, you couldn't simply go, since cavalry was decisive, at war just with cavalry. That's not what it means, right? Infantry was always necessary as an auxiliary arm, and in some cases it reached some of the highest levels of sophistication. This was particularly true in the Italian communes. I made some videos about them. We will come back on them. But if you want to study the full maximization of infantry tactics and effectiveness, and quality in general of medieval infantry, you have to look at second half of the 13th century, early 14th century Italy, right? Then again, there are in that latter phase, in the beginning of the 14th century, other examples like the Flemish, the Ditmarsche, the Scottish, the Swiss to some extent, that are again able, with actually not particularly advanced nor actually pretty large armies, to defeat cavalry on many occasions. But again, these are mostly peripheral contexts, also not particularly advanced ones, telling you not even from a strictly military point of view. The Flemish were just commoners in the sense that they're, you see, with that's why I was talking about the importance of infantry subordination to cavalry, because the cavalrymen were also the actual military professionals of the situation, were infantry professionals as well, but generally speaking, those who ruled, right, in a society where that level of hierarchy existed, had the single most advanced military competence and expertise. One of the greatest myths, probably in the populistic way we're being told, medieval warfare is in fact that those damn French cavalrymen that got slaughtered during the 100 Years' War, they did not understand infantry tactics. They were so stubborn and bigoted and whatever. They didn't know. This is probably the single most putrescent foretastator regurgitation of historical nonsense that we have witnessed in the last generations. Knights were traumatically aware of the constant importance and potential that infantry had, way more than the same people who killed them from foot. And just warfare is something a bit more complex than, how do you say, paper, scissors, and stone. And it's mostly a struggle between moral forces. And if you actually look at what cavalry charges were and tactics, well, that's all in what cavalry actually does in the heavy way, and the decisive one, in fact. And we saw it at Kilted, we saw it in many other engagements. They were actually pretty damn good at what they were doing. They came an inch close to actually breaking the enemy. And so that was actually the best way that they could and would go, and surely you're not more intelligent or capable than a 13th century knight. Just saying, just reminding you. So in general, mistakes do exist. There are overestimations, underestimations, but in general, like the way they made war from sources, and believe me, I spent my share of years just buried within them, studying exclusively this cavalry infantry confrontation at some point, reveal you an iron logic at all level of the art of war here, and in a way that was so homogeneous, and in a world that, after all, did not change that much over time, that they didn't even ask themselves, or more than much, why things went the way they did. Even in those infantry victories, yes, they could surprise them at some point, but they were not something that actually was seen as revolutioning the system structurally. The world remained exactly as it was. This was a big deal, but it wasn't the beginning of something, more deterministically, materialistically, structured in a different way that, in fact, would not come to be until much later, by the way. In the 13th century, actually, nobody was really seeing this in Western Europe as well. The infantry exploits were very, very important. Those episodes about the Flemish experiments, the Lombard resistance, that were incredibly inspiring during, especially the 13th, but from the 12th, the second half of the 12th and the 13th century. Also for the later developments, morally, because they sort of proved that the commoners could emancipate themselves from the condition of moral and material inferiority that the elite had relegated themselves in. But you must understand there also which parts of Europe, which kind of political and social balance existed there. There are, again, very different types of backgrounds from which these infantry revival comes from, that again may have a relative value, right? Of course, compared to the absolute one. Again, not all the places, but not basically none of the places that witnessed infantry victories in the early 14th century was actually the place where the strongest current infantry existed in Europe, right? So be extremely careful about this, because it's not like you must have gotten into the specifics in order to know that, because otherwise it's not intuitive. There's no such like the simple dichotomy, like these guys were poorer, richer, whatever. Like, no, right? You find so many different factors actually occurring. And again, in those videos about medieval infantry, sort of discuss this, but we will come surely multiple times on this, because it's something that at least I fixate on particularly. So today we talk about the units types, and so just the different type of gear that these soldiers had. I will also not digress particularly on the social background of these individuals, because when you look at their armament, they were pretty much all similar. Like the way the heavy infantry would equip itself at this point, like just like cavalry, was becoming extremely similar. Right? It's not the same. They do not go in parallel in that way, but there is an increasing professionalization in warfare that brings to a greater arms and armor uniformity. You see it also in cavalry, with the mercenary companies becoming de facto just an homogeneous pack of heavily armored troops. Like there is not much difference between the squire, the old sort of guy who just aided like without much of an equipment on its own, that the master was heavily armed. No, it's all much more collectively organized, and especially, of course, the best evidence that we have comes also from the sort of the places where infantries were wealthier, more affluent. But if you really look at cavalry infantry at this point, they all look pretty similar, again, in the various places in Europe. One of, if not the best source for at least the manuscript evidence of arms and armor during the 13th century in Western Europe is the in fact, 13th century French Maciejowski Bible that I have inserted, and it's very easily recognizable by medieval history amateurs. Even I inserted lots of pictures in the recent video about medieval northern French warfare, but also here I added part of all the infantry types that I had gathered from other videos, because now I have a very large database of pictures from Wikimedia Commons that I sort of don't have to search for anymore, because I have already cataloged in a sort of functional way. And in there we can the manuscript illuminations are not, of course, fully precise, realistic depiction of how these guys really looked. But of course, the details, like the level of variation and the same homogeneity as we stressed, is very, very accurate. And even when you see something a bit fantasy, like falchions cutting through armor, etc., well, that's a bit of, again, artistic license here and there that you must be able to recognize. But even in that case, what they show means something, even just beyond what is strictly represented. So you have to understand that there are lots of problems, for example, during the 13th century in identifying certain sources of the few that we have. In fact, that show, of course, how infrequent, rare it was. How, for example, metal armor for like barding or half barding for horses came about, and we have some depictions where you do not know whether these guys are actually meant to to be wearing, like, according to the material, the type of representation where this was made, whether it's, I don't know, leather armor or it's actual metal, or whether maybe it's a padded armor, but whether there is metal underneath. So iconographic evidence is always tricky. We do not even have, we have a lot of archaeological evidence, of course, but these were times in which a lot of that armor would be simply reused, reconverted. It was a very active dynamic, again, the peak of medieval civilization. So paradoxically, yes, we do have a lot of stuff, but we don't have it in that serial structure, systematic way, because this armor would have not buried for preservation. We have a lot of tomb slabs depicting, in fact, we made multiple videos on this, like the type of knightly arms and armor that are still, however, sculpted, which is not like having the actual pieces. But you understand, for the commoners, for those who would have regularly fought on foot, it's a wholly different story. As I was saying before, actually infantry was even more materially segmented in terms, again, of equipment than cavalry at this point in history. The levies continued, even though like they were rarer. But again, the decisive arm was sort of much more homogeneous, and we know it much better as, in fact, cavalry and knightly arms and armor than the entirety of the infantrymen. That would have been, incidentally, also the ones more maybe reflecting the actual cultural and social differences between these the various historical areas, even though, again, their material culture was rather poor in the first place. But there were also different ways in which they fought, different sort of levels of tactical development and organization. So that is also a thing that we'll have to study at some point. So when we look at the evidence provided by the Maciejowski Bible, we see a characteristic armor of the one found in most pictorial sources of the same date. There is no mystery about how arms and armor of the time looked like. This particular manuscript does give us a, however, much clearer picture of certain types of armor. Importantly enough, for lighter troops, the kilted one. Right, we can argue this is actually the best, aside from say the many illuminations, so to show us again what mostly male was about. Not only that we have quantitatively one of, if not the greatest source of all, but there are of course other sources that are much more. Maybe they show you just one type of armor. Of broader gear, but this is incredibly detailed and more particular in its kind. Well, the Maciejowski Bible shows us at best kilted armor, right? Because this is also part of the reason it represents larger combat, say more populated combat scenes, right? And so infantry, also lighter types of cavalry, etc., are given just even for the sake of the artist's realistic interest, like in sort of accurately representing what a bunch of soldiers of a unit would look like statistically in equipment at the time, is in fact the guys who would use that lighter type of gear, right? For example, do you know the difference between Aketon and Gambeson? They're pretty much the same thing. We will see now that they have just a bit of a different anatomically protective function, as far as it seems. But here we are in pre-Linnean times, and there is even not such strict categorization. There is not such thing like you open a medieval dictionary that it tells you encyclopedistically like what's the difference between this or that voice. No, we don't have that. They didn't reason like that. They didn't care about that because objectively it was not important, right? Just through the sources we realize that yes, one term is associated with one thing and one with the other, and we have to be careful and sensitive enough to understand the difference. Well, both were, Aketon and Gambeson, of either leather, linen, or woolen armor. Essentially, they were tunics made up of this material, stuffed with all type of padding, like could be wool, cotton, tow, old rags even, having multiple functions. The primary one surely protective, like in terms from enemy blows. We will see now to which capacity, right? Of course, this type of armor was designed to absorb important level of impact from all type of weapons, preferably projectiles. Not because, let's say, taking a crossbow hit, at close distance would particularly prevent you, like from being pierced by wearing this armor, but because the majority of the projectiles that you could see flying on a medieval battlefield were mostly spent coming at not precisely 90 degrees angle, etc. And as we'll see, even like pretty heavily traumatic blows delivered by say melee weapons at close range could be effectively absorbed by this type of armor, which again doesn't mean that it prevented you from getting a broken arm, etc. But say better that having your arm, further cut, disintegrated. So in contemporary sources, that's another thing you must understand forcibly if you want to understand, of course, what even a medieval battle was about psychologically, is colors, right? All these, this is the Maciejowski Bible, but we know this about medieval armor as well. Like knights at this point were all colored. They had mail of all different kinds, not just the burned one or the gilded one for the ultra rich. The first one was actually for preventing from oxidation, but all these very colors, and equally in fact, we see, at least in the illumination, pastel shades of red, blue, green, yellow, buff, right? Red seems to have been the most popular color. I made a video about the infantry crusader of the same era. Like if you go in the Crusades Warfare playlist, you will find that, and it's essentially like what I say in this video. I mean, not really, I'm taking other sort of references and examples, but you can look at that guy just from the same source, and there I explained what his equipment would have been more stereotypically like. The Byzantine chronicler Nicetas Choniates, we are about essentially the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, a guy who witnessed the Fourth Crusade, described the kilted armor of the Piedmontese nobleman Conrad of Montferrat, that at the time was the commander of the Byzantine army's Latinicon regiment. We are in 1187. I would like to make a video about Conrad of Montferrat, because, as you know, he's sort of a unfairly infamous figure of the Third Crusade. Actually, he has a hell of a military background and biography in the first place, and this is just per se fascinating. Nicetas describes a guy who served, essentially commanded this regiment of Latins, right? So having Western arms and armor coming from, and just military habits coming from the West, right? There would be a lot to tell about how, by that point, of course, the same Byzantine warfare was receiving a very heavy Western influence by these same guys, but there is also something like the habit to specific combat styles, specific equipment that certain troops do not change, or maybe do not even need to change, because, for example, this heavy infantry or cavalry from the West was actually stronger than what existed in the Levant compared to its equivalent on average, and that the Byzantines were simply, again, using, literally in this case. And in fact, Choniates, describing Conrad of Montferrat's kilted armor specifically, records it to have been made of as many as 18 layers of red linen. Basically had this, different rounds like of linen on your arm. It was, of course, produced in just as a single piece before. Like you didn't have your arm wrapped with all these layers all of the time. It was just in the standard pack, which was in fact also treated to make it, as we've seen, an effective armor with a mixture of salt and rough wine, so that the armor was made allegedly impervious to sword or lance blows. So again, offensive weapons were incredibly performing, and just the strengths, the levels of sharpness and other characteristics would render of course, padded armor less effective in a general way than metal armor. That was in fact the more expensive, the one used by the elite. And of course, the padded armor was worn usually underneath the same metal armor, so it was part of what's the basics, right, that the infantryman would have. Here we're talking about the armor of a nobleman himself. This is what is usually said, that the Westerners would have used lighter armor during the Crusades, for example, in part because of local influence, but also because of the weather that was hotter, whatever. It is part of the story, but never think that, like, since something is in part uncomfortable in a certain context, like, you would risk your life. You prefer to do so, just even considering the standard you are into. Again, these guys are people who were literally chopping themselves to pieces out there on the battlefield, so that would have been sort of the least of their concerns. So there were different reasons, but padded armor, Aketons, Gambesons were pretty much universal at this point, right? And basically, anyone would go with a minimal degree of armor into combat, and this was usually this one, right? Usually, even as we'll see now, the lightest infantrymen would have some sort of metal helmet of sort, but for the body, we will see now again the difference between Aketon and Gambeson, anatomically what it is. The average infantryman used this padded armor on a regular basis. Now, why the mixture of salt and rough wine, chemically speaking? Well, to stiffen the armor, salt acts as a natural preservative and has antimicrobial properties, which helps to prevent the growth of bacteria and mold on the linen padding, in this case. So the acidity of the wine helped to break down the fibers of the linen, making them more pliable and easier to shape into the desired armor padding. The combination of salt and rough wine likely creates a chemical reaction that helps to bind the fibers of the linen together more tightly, right, creating a stiffer and more protective padding for armor. So the rough texture of the wine may have also helped to create a more abrasive surface on the linen, which could provide additional protection against blunt force trauma in battle. Not much against cutting, but also, right, piercing, cutting would have been more difficult to absorb there without significant damage. This armor did get cut, but it's still, again, not all those hits are clean, straight, precise, so delivered with the right force. So this is still, protecting you from most hits, which are not the most dangerous individually, but still, if you did wear armor, would be pretty nasty anyway. And again, the human body is incredibly delicate for that matter, right? We have another reference from around the same time, a chronicler of the Third Crusade, Geoffroy de Visnoff, who also refers to kilted armor as, quote, difficult to pierce. He describes the pourpoint, that is an alternative name for this type of armor, often decoratively embroidered. At this point, the 13th century again shows this important level of even a relative uniformity of certain identity devices, certain uniform colors, decorations for the retinues of particular knights, etc. We talk about this sort of uniforming dynamic in multiple videos. And de Visneuf tells us that this kilted armor was made, in fact, similarly, quote, of many folds of linen, just like Coniates told us for Montferrat. Needless to say, especially considering that this armor had to be obtained in substantial quantities for everyone, with the due divides between the elite and the commoner, etc., its thickness varied a considerable lot. As we've seen, it's a it was an expensive type of armor to some degree. I mean, to the degree that you wanted to make it effective, but see, even old rags to absorb certain impact could do, right, in the padding. But kilted corselets, if we were to just draw an average, at least judging from later evidence, are recorded being up to 5 centimeters thick, right? Which is, again, a substantial amount. It just gives you the idea of how not impenetrable it would be just on its organic basis and its thickness. But the structural characteristic could vary to an important degree. Kilted body armor had, of course, been existing in different ways from centuries, right? And some scholars say that basically Western Europeans began to make a more widespread use of this because of their outre-mer experience, because the Saracens used it frequently. In fact, Aketon comes literally from the deformation of the Arab term Al-qutun, which means cotton, which of course referred to the type of padding. In this case, of course, also in the Islamic world, there were different ways this kilted armor was realized, and hence Aketon anyway. I personally don't believe that this has necessarily too much to do with crusades per se. I believe in general, at least as far as I've seen from general tactics, arms and armor, we made really many videos, as you know, on this channel, focusing especially on the foreign influence and single regional context. We've tried to trace parallelisms between armor just developing in certain parts. I don't know, in the Middle East you find some equivalent in, I don't know, in Hungary, and you say, oh, maybe there is an influence, whatever. But if you actually look at the broader picture, realize again that the way this arms and armor develop is largely homogeneous. I mean, the fundamentals are pretty similar for everybody involved. Technology adapts fundamentally to pre-existing tactics, and so the needs that made that technology required and work and so forth. And say Western European warfare does have its distinctive characteristics that evidently by far do not have to do with external influence, and if kilted padded armor was adopted to this extent, it was evidently due to a specific local and sort of universal need rather than whatever documentation tells us. I will not digress now on why certain scholars said, okay, well, this stuff comes from the East, the West, whatever. But the idea is that since the West also starts producing more evidence, right, certain things come up more easily to some extent. And of course, some parts of Europe had been technologically more advanced in the Mediterranean, where there was sort of more cultural and material promiscuity. So the idea is that if, I don't know, a type of armor is first witnessed in one place, I don't know, in 9th century Islam, and then 10th century Byzantines have them, and 11th century Westerners have it documented, even though it's maybe just one evidence, right? I'm making here for the sake of example, but it does happen like this for certain types of cavalry tactics or certain shield designs, whatever. Then it had been born for the first time in Islam, and then, you know, so the West must have gotten it from no, right? It just made a pretty hefty, like 2.5 hours long video about the spread of the stirrup, in which I explain how fundamentally, in fact, all these various cultures, Franks, Byzantines, and Muslims, had in the fundamentals a parallel development of most of their tactics, arms, armor, general, technological advancements. And it's not even technology you should focus on, but specifically what kind of, again, tactics that is a much broader, more systemical issue looked like, right? And so the need of having a padded armor is something pretty much universal. I mean, there is a great scholarly dispute on how much, for example, in antiquity, padded armor was already there, right? And we do think that actually it could have been there, even though we do not have a quite explicit or, just pretty quantitative amount of evidence in the first place. Consider, of course, that kilted armor is organic, and so that's the point. Most also of these times, examples haven't really arrived to us because they perished that quickly. So when you look at 13th century Western art, you realize that it was a tripudium of cultural output, and so you see this huge evidence that finally makes us more aware of certain types of arms and armor. But let's say it becomes difficult again for certain times of the 14th or the 15th century, not in this specific case, but say in other types of specificities of arms and armor, to know exactly how things really were. And in any case, we haven't been on a 13th century battlefield to just assess whether these theories, these conjectures, are just fitting with, let's say, with reality. And the actual deal is that, of course, aside from what we do, they fought extensively at the time in ways that we barely understand, like exactly also in historiography, the very fundamentals. And so that when you look at these aspects, you realize not that they aren't even so relevant in comparison. And I and myself not particularly into arms and armor specifically. I was about to marry an archaeologist, and she was very much fixated just with these things. But let's say I like the art of war, and I have a different approach to these topics in the first place. So the main difference between the Aketon and the Gambeson that I explained also in that video about the 13th century Crusader infantry is apparently, again, even though there is no full distinction between the two things, they superimpose because conceptually they are, at least by composition, the same thing. The Aketon was apparently more just about a torso protection, whereas the Gambeson had sleeves frequently mentioned. And so we indirectly know that because we find, again, the references associated with sleeves, but hardly even just an explanation. There is no medieval source telling us. 21st century reader, I just wanted to let you know this incredibly important information that actually we intend as Aketon just a sleeveless kilted armor, whereas the Gambeson has sleeves more often than not. Well, that obviously enough, not actually an important datum, right? I know that there are lots of people out there, like reenactors, hemas, whatever, that are obsessed with that, but it's objectively, like, it's an important datum, but it's not as important as an incredibly larger and by far, by scale, like more important issues about medieval warfare that get routinely skipped as if the most important things in history never mattered, because they are too difficult to research the actual explanation of why that is the case. So there is indeed also, by the way these two terms are associated, Gambeson and Aketon, that makes us understand how the two types of armor were in fact distinguished and associated at the same time. Apparently the Gambeson was the older variety of the two. I think the sense is that as male, you get like this sort of extensively protected armor with sleeves and all as the basis, and then you will add some extra armor, for example, just to protect the torso. This is fundamentally how plate armor spreads, for example, during this period. It mostly starts around the abdomen. And generally speaking, you can see it also in other times in history for the Byzantine cataphracts of the 10th, 11th century, like, I don't know, the 3 layers of armor, right? Actually 4 if you consider the kilted one, or 5 even, from the core to the external. Kilted armor, mail armor, lamellar armor, then mail armor, and kilted armor. This was the single most hyper ultra heavy cavalry ever fielded. Of course, these guys barely moved, and they caused an extraordinary enormity. That's also why the Nicephorian cataphracts sort of were not the game changer in warfare. But during the 13th century, as we were seeing here, Western European infantries, especially the ones from the communes, were incredibly rich, right? Even just per capita, and so they could equip themselves. But maybe they were not, again, they were not professional soldiers. They were local militias, but they had a very good equipment, and together with moral force, they were able to pull off those feats on the battlefield as well, even when they knew that there wasn't much they could do in terms of defeating cavalry, but they would stand their ground, and being helped also by their material capacity. But this also entails a certain pride and interest in that same wealth and protection, etc. So it all makes, and so you could see this multi-layered kilted armor, right? Essentially an Aketon over a Gambeson, right? I'm not sure about the philological updates in the last years, but it seems that the first time the term Aketon appears is in a roman de Perceval dated to the 60s of the 12th century, and in Wace's Roman de Roux, roughly around the same time, like the 60s up to 1174, right? Speaking of the etymology of Gambeson, Aketon, as we've seen, is Al-qutun, refers to cotton. Gambeson doesn't have to do actually with the term jambe, the leg, right? It has actually to do with the belly, the vamba, which is an originally Germanic word from Old Frankish. This is interesting because you see that, as we were explaining recently in the video about medieval northern French warfare, it's mostly from this area that, of course, some of the most updated arms and armor, together with the entire Frankish warfare, was emerging from, like as what we call properly Western European. We have even older texts referring to the word Bambais, which is even more Germanic sounding, being an equivalent of Bamba. And of course, the fact that it refers to the belly is exactly what we're saying right now about, like, where the first plate armor in this very century spreads, like covering the abdomen around the entirety of it, right? And so the Gambeson, in this sense, would have been an initially conceived protection, perhaps born like the Aketon originally, to defend the core part of the body, and that had only eventually extended to with sleeves. And so the Aketon being added up as a sort of extra current armor, such as, again, the plate one, anatomically, even the lamellar one that, as we've seen, did still have a relevant place in Western warfare, wasn't just an Eastern influence. And in fact, this is, generally speaking, interesting. This Aketon Gambeson could be composed in different ways, used, of course, one over the other. For example, if in one of these illuminations you ever see long sleeves and a stiff upright collar, and you see different layers, you can't quite distinguish these pieces of kilted armor more often than not. For example, the same guy from the 13th century, I don't remember what it was just from, like he was from the 13th century, it was from the Maciejowski Bible, but I may have been talking also about for the video title from the 11th to the 13th century, but that guy I'm referring to, that's a very beautiful picture of this. You have, again, sleeves and this pretty thick, stiff, upright collar that is also something that develops particularly, in this case, in the East. You see it also in Balkan warfare, for example, during the 14th centuries, somehow common, because there are a lot of archery, especially with the Mongols from the 13th century and all this broader area from Eastern Europe to the Levant, had dramatically increased the need of protecting your neck and every single opening, that especially in those vital vascularized areas you wanted to protect at all cost. Well, it's more likely that, of course, the sleeves belong to the Gambeson and the collar to the Aketon, right? Presumably, we do not know fully. Again, this armor could be made in so many different ways. We have no idea. We can't quite trace it, but it sort of makes sense overall for the type of design. Also, helmets could be, and probably they were actually the most common type of kilted armor. In general, you see maybe a peasant wouldn't have a metal helmet. Maybe yet they would have them. In some ways, again, it depends on who mobilized them. Some peasants were rich enough actually to have metal helmets. Again, we're talking about a fairly prosperous time by pre-industrial standards in 13th century Western Europe. But it could equally be a padded arming cap, in alternative again to the either a kettle helmet or just a simple hemispherical bassinet, the latter actually becoming pretty standard in later times. If you look even at like the bassinet for the same soldiers underneath, say, the great helm, for example, etc., like they would be pretty standard for everyone. If you look at the Oxford chest for the Flemish infantry, for example, again, material wealth of these commoners from the rich towns. This doesn't tell ipso facto how good they were, what their actual military expertise was, but in general you see an important degree of homogenization in the way war was made, right? After all, helmet is not that expensive, but padded arming caps were also a thing, and it would be worn equally underneath, for example, these metal ones, just like it was true for mail, and again, padded armor underneath, or even over, right? I think in the case of the padded arming caps, like, we do not have evidence of that. Could have been theory there, but it was more usual to find more padded armor over mail while having it still underneath, right, as an extra protection. But for helmets, I don't think there is evidence of this. Aside from this excursus on kilted padded armor, of course, the Western European infantrymen had also much heavier types. We don't have, I think, to digress too much on the coat of mail. That would have been for the more heavily armored types, like just the most common type of armor in Western Europe. What is fascinating is the presence, for example, of scale armor, scale corselets, undoubtedly based on leather foundation most of the times. We do not see sleeves, often like scale armor. It's just like what we said now about the Aketon, so sort of extra, importantly heavy type of armor, mostly designed to protect the torso, right? Most of scale armor would be present in, let's say, in countries like, for example, Germany. Generally speaking, the longitudinally speaking Central Europe, so from Scandinavia to Germany to Italy, because these were countries more exposed to Eastern influences. This is true, but also just more missile warfare to some extent. I mean, think about the 13th century, the Mongol invasion. In fact, the Germans did fight, like the Mongols arrived at the gates of their same country. The Mediterranean did see some important type of missile harassment, especially from the Byzantine forces on the western. So this type of armor was probably better suited. Like Scandinavia had also historically some important connections with Eastern Europe, so this explains mostly the frequency. We know that Emperor Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor, between 1111 and 1125, we made some videos about him and the various controversies with the papacy of the Salians, etc., had a body of knights equipped in horn scale armor in 1150, right? And horn was probably with other organic material. This was an effective type of armor among this type. Was very much in use in the West until the 12th century. Like also during the 13th, we don't have to think being that rare. As a matter of fact, scales were mostly made of iron, of course, by this time. But again, illustrative evidence that is important because again, horn also deperishes more easily than metal, does tell us this, and so we have to take it importantly into consideration. Consider this: we've seen it in the video about lamellar armor and many other unit types. For every type of armor design, you have to think that all kind of material was used. Like you would have for the design. This is valid also for ancient times. We know that there were bronze, so-called segmented armor for the Roman legions. We found fragments of this. We know iron was much more convenient and so much more used. But every single type, also leather, etc., was used. Right? The degree is somehow difficult to, like, leather armor was not. It's difficult to measure, say, popular perception on this, how much you would even quantify normally the idea of leather armor aside from what movies show you, etc. Of course, the idea is that the metal, the iron armor was much more, by far the prevalent one, unless we consider again the kilted padded one that however was also less effective, protectively speaking, and therefore just mostly integrated as the basis for some type of defense that, however, always entailed there were heavier forces equipped with metal that were also just the most exposed directly. Here about infantry warfare, we have to point out that even though infantry played a very important role in combat, mostly at this point being deployed on the wings and trying to take the enemy ones out so that they could close on the enemy cavalry. Each battle was essentially, battle line was constructed like this. Their engagement was much less intense than the one of heavy cavalry that necessarily needed to be much better equipped just to withstand the shocking blows and the general brutality of it all. Of course, infantry was equally nasty when you see, for example, the development of crossbow warfare at this point, like especially when these wings closed in the flanks of the enemy cavalry, like where, remember, horses were largely unarmored. They had padded armor themselves, the threes, for the ultra elite, like one soldier out of 10 here, some, say, metal comparison of sort, but the horses' bellies from the side were very good target. We know that horses died like flies in these engagements, even though they cost enormously, but knights were much better armored than horses. This choice was very scientific. But in this sense, aside from this specific circumstances that were asymmetric, the moment in which you close in on the enemy that has lost wing protection, you realize that infantry was individually less involved, like the single individual infantryman, and so his necessity to be armored in combat for that. And as always, like, it's the first ranks that fundamentally need to carry out the greater struggle. You have pretty deep files, of course. With cavalry it's different. With cavalry you basically have just a few lines that actually charge in and have to actually smash into the enemy, and they will have to also pull back, reform, whatever. So they really, you understand why feudal warfare at this point is dominating it, why cavalry is decisive, right? Because they were developed to that extent. Infantry played in a different way, also with mass, with cheaper equipment, and this was reflected in the political and social order, in a general sense. But again, never underestimate these auxiliary roles that were infantries were tough as hell, and that could again withstand heavy cavalry charges during an entire day without breaking, right? And eventually having to abandon the field with heavy losses, but still not broken, right? And you may wanna mind, really. Speaking of offensive weapons, this is also a very interesting topic. Again, today we talk about this general type of equipment. It's obvious that we will look in depth for other historical units types at single weapons. I don't know, think about the Gepinde staff of the Flemish, right, or the Italian roncone, or like you have like many also older, more, say, still crudely effective weapons like the Scottish double-handed axe or something like that. You have a single focus on each weapon, but here we have to mostly show how heterogeneous actually the offensive weapons were to some degree, and however how they would be employed collectively by these troops. So I'm making it very simple for the greatest effectiveness. So there is one major cornerstone here that we must accept in all this. In order to stop a cavalry charge, the only, and I stress the only, the exclusive weapon without which you cannot do literally anything is the pike, right? You don't stop cavalry with halberds, you don't stop cavalry with axes, you don't stop it with missile weapons. If you have heard of that, like from incredibly cheap and uninformed, alleged 100 Years War explanation, just know that it's a complete load of garbage. It's combined arms tactics. Yes, missile weapons are very important. They can't bog down cavalry charges, but alone they do not, right? If there were, it had been just longbowmen or crossbowmen against heavy cavalry, they wouldn't, like, their anatomic physicality would not exist anymore, right? And cavalry would have completely smashed them. The only way you stop a cavalry charge is with pikes, right? And the first ranks of infantry have to be constituted by pikemen. Maybe just 2 ranks, right? 3 ranks. Here we do not have of course, the pike square of later times. The pike in itself is not that easy of a weapon to use, because even though it exists since prehistory and throughout all this time, pikes have been used by every single army. So it's not a Renaissance thing, it's not a classical thing. Medieval armies have universally pikes among them all the time to stop cavalry in the front. It's just that the pike is as effective as long as it is, but in order to be effective in a formation that has the consistency of stopping a cavalry charge, is cohesive enough, this requires enough, in fact, training, collective training by the front ranks, which is the reason why pikemen largely at this point are I mean, infantry is not decisive, and pikemen are passive. They stop on the battlefield, they take position, they are arrayed, very often by the knights that told them how to do so. Speaking of the commoners, even for the great, say, commoners' victories like Kortrijk, for example, the Counts of Flanders were literally stationed within the commoners, and they told them how to deploy, to array in battle, because those were the actual professionals that had to tell them what to do. Yes, these infantries did advance and did maintain even a very good cohesion, but in order to withstand a cavalry charge, they had to stop, right? They weren't to attack cavalry on their own, right? They would do so only if they took them from the side, which at that point they could have done it in any way, and it would have been detrimental, even if they had been in broken order, in open order. As it would happen in certain circumstances, they had a good actual coordination with cavalry. They would march together with it. You always find them close to cavalry. You don't see like infantry sacking, like this is not good, they get lost or whatever, no, or broken. They maintain a very good cohesion, but in order to withstand again a cavalry charge, they stopped, right? And mostly, in fact, infantry was not supposed to face cavalry frontally in the first place. That's where they were stationed on the flanks, and the enemy would do the same. I'm simplifying here about the enormity of the problem of how we know when these wings first appeared, became standardized. It's all a problem because in the 13th century, again, you find huge battles in which we know that infantry was there, but nobody literally ever talks about them during the battle from the sources. We know from the 12th century, the 11th century, other types of arrays. So also what I sort of documented in part of my work, it's how these wings became better defined, documented how they could in fact operate ever more synchronically with cavalry. It had not always been there. For example, the Lombard infantries at some point would go in battle during, for example, the second half of the 12th century, the times of Legnano, the Lombard League, etc., separated. Right, you have battles like Carcano, for example, where you have the infantry that goes by, like, marches in his own, on its own, and then cavalry too, and they meet with Imperial cavalry. Infantry gets broken, and Imperial cavalry goes against the Lombard cavalry, and this broken infantry actually regroups and goes to sack the Imperial camp. That's very also abnormal. Like this speaks of levels of cohesion and equality that you don't find. This is an exception. The rest of Western Europe, infantry did not have the capacity to do that. They were very often very much more fearful, like worse equipped and trained forces. But there was at the time sort of more contrast between the militas and the penditas, right? We talked about this in the videos about the Italian communes and especially the rise of the people and etc. But towards the second half of the 13th century, as I was talking to you about, essentially there is an ever more statal direction, and so cavalry and infantry managed to blend together in this incredibly effective and as effectively synergic army, also unprecedented size, that literally is possibly the single most advanced medieval army ever existed in terms of actual arms integration and overall effectiveness. But overall, like, again, pikemen are in the front. The rest of the infantry doesn't quite have much else to do but supporting those guys, because when infantry stops and they get the cavalry charge, what is important is to stop the cavalry charge with the pikes, right? So horses manage to break through in some part of the line, whatever. That's very dangerous because they are literally going to break through if you don't let them pass. And these were steamrolling machines. But that's when, however, they had lost momentum. These guys managing to break through were not, hopefully, larger amounts. Otherwise, the entire formation would. And this is how it happened. That's why cavalry was decisive, would break. So as soon as you had stopped enough guys with the pikes and sort of disrupted a bit this cavalry charge, where cavalry at that point is at the riskiest of its condition, like cavalry is never as weak as just after a cavalry charge, then you need guys equipped with blunt weapons of some sort. You have all sort of pole axes, but also just axes, like think about the Gepindestav, again, other smashing weapons that had to hopefully be able to even like act as can openers, like opening armor, smashing, causing trauma underneath, whatever. Hopefully dismounting these guys. Think about at that point, bills, falchions would be great because you could say cut a horse leg, unhorse in the night and stuff like that. But it was also incredibly dangerous because the horses would bite you and kick you and break your neck. Like they would do that even when they had stopped charging. Knights defended themselves like crazy. You have to imagine, heads being chopped all around. And so it's not really even just the single most psychologically comforting moment to approach. Like the actual incarnation of the top divine imperial superiority that is essentially going to take you away from this, again, telluric force that normally commoners perfectly fail to be part of in their overall misery, right? And it's really a matter of how much you want to rip off the guts of the person in front of you that actually matters in warfare. Besides weapons, just these were assorted in a way that would be more functional. So the posterior ranks to the pikes were mostly these guys. And for the rest, there was a general, let's say, standard what even troops that fought after, I don't know, as knightly retinues on foot and whatever, would be equipped like. Spears were, of course, the most common type of weapon. You could still put an effective stand against an enemy cavalry if you didn't have a pike, but getting posterior ranks, you had most of your guys armed with spears. Swords were also common at this point. By the 14th century, it would become really cheap. Even an average longbowman could afford in the 14th century a sword normally, aside from his skills or the quality of the weapon. But already in the 13th century, why not? An archer could have a sword and just being dangerous in that way. Bows were, now we'll talk about missile warfare a bit. Axes too, again, this versatile weapon, but mostly against spears and weapons that could be very traumatic against armor. Right. There are also in the terminology so many different names that really you can't categorize. Some of the terms are tricky because part of these weapons had developed from, for example, working tools, agricultural ones, etc. So even in modern vernacular, if you say something like cleaver, right, that was an actual weapon that looked like an axe if you found the corresponding national vernacular in some context. But when you think of a cleaver, it's just today the kitchen thing, right? Whereas this would have fit mostly as a generic concept of axe type in that circumstance. So again, I hope at some point to make one huge video trying to explain these things a bit more in detail, but just it's the essential, aside from the name, that really matters. What these weapons were primarily conceived for in combat, right? We have sometimes even very nasty looking stuff. For example, I don't know if you know the false of Fossa, which is sometimes depicted also in the Maciejowski Bible. It's just imagine the typical falchion, like, this sort of big, not really knife, because the grip is like the one of a sword, but it's a thin blade that broadens at the top. It's mostly meant to chop, and actually, and also in the Maciejowski Bible, if I'm not wrong, it's used by knights as well, because paradoxically, you'd think that's for peasants, right? No, because who can come so close to chop people with this relatively short weapon? Somebody who has enough armor, which the average commoner, would not do, because it was too exposed to the enemy. But imagine this like a falchion, but with the top not curved, but rather the falchion is single-edged, like the back of it is straight, whereas the first part, let's say the top frontal part, is curved, and the false fossile has the top frontal part all say, spiked with sort of curvilinear spaces in between the spikes, right? So it's something that is meant properly to tear limbs like of flesh apart, right, from someone, and it's terrifying, and it's exactly what it had been done, evidently against unarmored enemy or lightly armored enemies, such as this was. And again, the people, the commoners, were, of course, as always, some of the most traumatically violent parts of the population, so that they would hate each other in horrifying ways. If, again, while a certain type of history tended to push towards the class struggle, the idea is that very often these guys were fighting for their lords, their communities, etc., and they didn't give a damn about, actually they despised each other for being of that estate if they were the enemies, and they would slaughter them in massive numbers to degrees that, of course, were mostly based on the identity of the single polity that they expressed, not the social group as such. There was the rivalry, of course, as we just said, between the cavalry and the infantry, as to some extent, right? But they were mostly cooperating, integrated with one another. There are all kind of weird things. Again, from the Maciejowski Bible, this incredibly precious pool of information, we find the same false fossil with a sort of umbrella handle like shaped grip. Here all the kind of opological considerations could be done. I do not descend in, but obviously this types of weapons were designed, represented also here in a detailed enough way to obviously having undergone a specific functionalization to hand-to-hand combat. A falchion could be even just a side weapon, girded at the waist, as it's represented in one of these sources. The falchion appeared in the late 12th century. Again, it evolved from other weapons, some say from the same sex, by the way. There are different things. Think about the mesa, the long mesa as well. Like it's literally a knife because it has as a grip, the same one of a knife, not of a sword. That's mostly, as you know, a German weapon. We will surely make some video about the long knife. Again, some of these were side weapons, even for the knights, for that matter. Here from this video, I'm of course secluding dismounted knights because, especially at this point, yes, they would fight on foot very often, especially as stormtroopers during sieges, because they were as decisive in sieges and with the same breaking function than in open field, right? Also, the rest of the infantry being subordinated in the same way. But here we're mostly speaking of commoners to sort of distinguish their functionality subordinated to the elite, right? The term falchion, by the way, derived, it's falchion, basically fauchon, in the Latin falx, which means scythe, right? And there are different types of weapons that are called like that. Also pole arms, as a matter of fact. And again, I was just writing about this, like not every time you find, I don't know, the term falx in Latin, you have absolutely to think that it means falchion at all, right? I also wrote about some of this bills, for example. The arpax, for example, can be considered as a bill in Latin, in the Latin sources of the time. In Eastern Europe, it was known as Tesak or Tasak, which instead had the same concept of cleaver behind, which is in fact not the same one that we would in the West think of falchion as such, and falx, in fact, it is the scythe. So this tells you how fluid the limits between the intertwinement between the actual weapon and the word that is used to describe them really is, right? And you can argue that every source is a thing on its own. You have to understand its semantics. There are terms that are maybe expressed just once in the entire Middle Latin literature, and you have to understand, in fact, in that specific case, what is that they mean, why that author came up with that. This is interesting because in this period, some vernaculars, European vernaculars, are properly becoming full-fledged literary languages, which they had not been before. So they had to literally reinvent in part the same language, and having to find a suitable standard to also to be understood. It's not that they had to invent a vocabulary for everybody to consult to read their own chronicle, but in fact they had to write directly in a language that was spoken, but it had not been written up to that point, or at least had rarely been, so that everybody would understand also what they were actually saying, right? And this is also a problem as far as the pre-humanistic choice of terms is connected, because if you write a chronicle in Latin and you have from the Latin vocabulary, Latin literature, just a certain amount of terms to define certain weapons that, first of all, you may have not been entirely sure what they were back in the day, say Roman times, but also you knew sometimes they were different from the ones that existed at your time, that you would have a vernacular term, but you could not use because you were writing in Latin, and so you had to make some compromise about. So you could shift the semantics of this for the modern reader to be sometimes confused, but you can arrive to understand this, right? Speaking of missile troops, again, today's video is not really about missile troops. In fact, I'm not going to discuss them. I wanted just to point out how they would operate most. Of course, missile troops are light infantry, so they're not able to stand their ground. They operate in open order. It's not often clear how they did so. I mean, jumping around back and forth, even between the lines, the various corridors between the units, because they were in open order, right? And harassing the enemy, or sometimes actually carrying out some sort of line fire, like shooting, just consecutively. This was done by, for example, the Italian crossbowmen at the Battle of Arsuf, notoriously, under Richard Lionheart against the Ayyubids. But you understand how similar, even to sort of modern warfare, this tactics, like pre-gunpowder technology missile tactics really were, right? And they were quite effective, quite orderly. They had, in that case, those Italian crossbowmen had an important level of training and professionalism. So they were also hired, as you know. They were, think about the Genoese ones and how prized they were. The majority, of course, of crossbowmen and archers out there were not particularly reliable troops, and as such they were not even considered. Again, it doesn't matter how powerful crossbows were or longbows, say the more performing bows and missile weapons in general. Again, they were not decisive. Missile infantry alone doesn't do anything. This is true in the steppe, this is true in the sanitary world. They can just increase dramatically the losses to a degree that just is scary and just even spectacular to see, probably, if you consider that sometimes you could have tens of thousands of quarrels being shot within an hour of fighting, like something insane, right? This is a massive firepower, like not inferior to the one of a Mongol army, as a matter of fact. So it's this all informs the way the same cavalry and infantry fight. The type of armor, the type of shields. Very often we're told, because of crossbow armor increased in... No, it's not because of crossbow alone, right? It's because, armor was available in ever more advanced way. There was greater material availability, and you would protect yourself more because you just needed that level of protection, and there were ever greater forces in the battlefield, but the missile one was not decisive, was not even remotely close to be. So it was important, it was relevant. It was, say, I don't know, a 10% of why you would increase your armor effectiveness, but it remains that, right? Naturally, we also know less about infantry versus infantry combat, possibly the least of all. Maybe just, in fact, the missile element being more obscure, even though sometimes the picked missile troops, like professional crossbow, etc., would receive more attention, at least computistically, among the, for example, the entirety of the forces compared to the rest of the infantry was otherwise much sort of less qualitative, homogeneous, right? So this makes you think, because if evidently, like, even this for example, these elite missile troops are very contained. Missile troops are contained compared to heavy infantry, and so you think evidently that it's not technology that made the difference, because if they had just evidently an elite crossbowman is more important than an individual heavy infantryman, but to a limit that you cannot, either you can find these guys in large numbers enough, they cost too much, or they, at the end of the day, reached a point for which they couldn't be more than a certain proportion in order to maintain the, say, the stopping power of the army. It's interesting because eventually during the 14th century heavy infantry would decline and crossbowmen would remain more important. They would increase at least more. They would increase their importance compared to the ones that they had in the past. So it's complicated, and again, these are things that one should study while studying the indentures, the condottes, and all these various, unfortunately, not, say, completely informing evidence, right? Something that you must always add as a piece after another, just to make sense of a whole picture that is much bigger, much more complex than you thought. So these are the problems in studying infantry during, say, the 13th century. That is even, however, one of the best times to research about these topics in the first place. Surely infantry blossoms in its power, in its complexity, in its effectiveness in the 13th century. There is no doubt. It had already been evident in the 12th. There were countries in Europe that had always had a very strong infantry tradition that is sort of overlooked, that had never also died out from ancient times, and others instead that were much more sparsely, let's say, the more statalized the system, usually the strongest the infantry is, right? Especially like in this Western European context where people were, I mean, this is not China where you know, one guy owns literally everything and the rest is just peasants with nothing, you know, in rice paddies breaking their backs. Here we're talking about the richest per capita peoples in the world, right? So their individual wealth is big, and it's not just material; it's moral, right? It speaks of a moral superiority, of a civil superiority, in fact, also military superiority, and so you must understand this to the degree it is. But it's obvious that infantries were sort of weaker in those countries where social cohesion was weaker, because, say, the aristocracy in fact had taken over more, right? Infantry was, for example, more important proportionally and locally in places like, say, the Celtic Fringe, but because the local aristocracy was sort of poorer than places like England, right? This is true sort of for Scandinavia as well. So again, as I said at the beginning, don't think that simply because infantry is relatively important in one place, it's actually stronger than in others where it's less relevant. It's a very easy mistake to do. And I can tell you from the, say, as an inside worker, that there is not any historiography on this topic. I'm writing about this stuff, but it's it's more like the disconcert in realizing that you would think at this point in our civilization would have covered these topics adequately. Well, no, right? It's either very fragmentary work and nobody addressing this systematically, or properly ignoring more than else the thing altogether. Mostly coming again from the fact that people don't study multiple countries at once. They don't care to some extent, right? And the motivations can be really negative in that sense. Speaking of why, in fact, the quality of academic work is generally speaking quite poor in this unitary and objective sense. So this video is, I don't know, we have to make it because it's important to talk about this generics in the first place. You can't quite ignore them. But it's obvious that we will have to make many more videos about many other different single infantry types that existed within this context that are sort of more typical, sort of better distinguishable. They had a specific role. They were the expression of a specific community or, particular tactical development. And so you can look at these guys, just even think that to an extent they were interchangeable. That, say, a weapon, for example, that develops in a specific country doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't used anywhere else, right? It's that's yet another common distortion based on the fact that maybe one source shows you something, but eventually maybe it's just iconographic and it's not even meant to be too realistic. Maybe even the design is realistic, but the distribution is not numerical. Like, so, and all these kind of problems. When you realize that everything was much more homogeneous than it seemed, and what actually matters is moral forces, and you're able to reconnect the military dimension to the political and social one in a unitary triad, well, then you're literally on horseback. You stop being an infantryman, but you get the upper hand, the advantage, the decisiveness, and that's how medieval warfare has to be studied, or any warfare for that matter. But for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoy this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.